Good evening or good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. This is the second in a series of videos I want to do, looking at the differences between Islam and Christianity and the source materials of the two religions. Today I want to have a look at the Quran, and this is just the beginning. I'll probably have to do another video on this. This is just an overview of what the Quran is. The Quran is a single book, unlike the Bible, which is a collection of books. It's composed of 114 chapters or surahs, and it's got each of those surahs is divided into verses. It's not chronological. The chapters are arranged in size order, the largest chapters being at the beginning and the shortest chapters being at the end. So some of the ones at the end were the first given, and some of the ones at the beginning were the last ones to be given. So it doesn't have a chronological order. Muslims believe that this book was divinely given over a 23-year period. And they also claim that when you read in an English translation, they would say this is not the Quran. This is just a translation. You can't translate it. It's too perfect to be translated, and you can't, and it can't be translated. You know, this is just sort of a commentary. They would call an English translation more likely a commentary on the Quran rather than the Quran itself, which we would probably find a bit strange because we would accept an English translation of the Bible. Now, why is that? Why do they say this? Well, I believe one of the reasons you will discover that when you try to read the Quran, it's difficult to understand, and it doesn't flow, it doesn't gel. There seems to be some sort of problem with it when you try and read it. It's quite a difficult book to try to get your head around and to understand, and it just doesn't seem to have the smoothness that you would expect in a book. And one of the ways that the Muslims get around this is to say that it's because of the translation. But we have a Bible that's been translated from Hebrew, from Aramaic, from Greek, and it's perfectly legible. It's perfectly easy to read. Now, if it's not the translation, what would be the other reason for it to be difficult to read? Well, it would be the source material. So I can only read English. I can only judge by the English translations of the Quran I've looked at. But I'm going to share the view of some experts in Arabic, and they will give their opinion on why they believe there are problems with the way the Quran is written. I mean, if anybody has tried to study or read the Quran, you will know what I'm talking about. So I'm just going to give you the views of some scholars. And these are people who are at the top of their fields, who are very learned people. The first one is a guy called Gerd Rudiger Puin. Now, Puin is a German scholar on Quranic historical paleography. So his subject is the study and scholarly interpretation of ancient Quranic manuscripts. He's an expert. He's a world expert in that subject. He is also a specialist in Arab orthography. He was a lecturer of Arabic at Saarland University in Saarbrücken, Germany. So he was a lecturer of Arabic. So he knows the Arabic language. General Puin was the head of a restoration project commissioned by the Yemeni government, which spent a significant amount of time examining the ancient Quranic manuscripts discovered in Sunana, Yemen in 1972. So he was called in by the Yemeni government to examine manuscripts that were discovered in Yemen in 1972, because he was an expert on the subject. And this is what this is what he has to say about the Quran. The first one deals more with the text. The second bit deals more with the grammar. So it says, my idea is that the Quran is a kind of cocktail of texts that were not all understood even at the time of Muhammad. So he's saying it's a collection of different texts, a cocktail. Many of them may even be 100 years older than Islam itself. We'll look at some of this stuff in another video. I'll have to do another video on the material that's in the Quran, where we think this material came from, because Muslims believe that it was a revelation from God, but there is evidence that this is not the case, and we will look in this in another video. Even within the Islamic traditions, there is a huge body of contradictory information, including a significant Christian substrata. One can derive a whole Islamic anti-history from them if one wants. Then he goes on to say, the Quran claims for itself that it is mubin or clear, but if you look at it, you will notice that every fifth sentence or so simply doesn't make sense. Don't forget, this is a guy who lectures in Arabic. Many Muslims and Orientalists will tell you otherwise, of course. Yeah, very, very true. Muslims will tell you it's a miracle, and it's the most eloquent book ever written. But the fact is that a fifth of the Quranic text is just incomprehensible. This is what has caused the traditional anxiety regarding translation. It was quite late that the Quran was translated from Arabic into English. It wasn't until 1734 that the first Quran was translated from Arabic into English, and then that was done by, believe it or not, by a Christian, a guy called George Sale. If the Quran is not comprehensible, if it can't even be understood in Arabic, then it's not translatable. So this is what this guy is saying. He said the problem is the original language. Now we are told it's the translation that's the problem, that it can't be translated. But what Puin is saying is that, or implying here, that it's because of the original. The problem is with the original. This is what he's implying here. People fear that, and since the Quran claims repeatedly to be clear, but obviously it's not, as even Arabic speakers of Arabic will tell you, there is a contradiction. Something else must be going on. So that's Gerd Rudiger Puin. You can check him out on Sheikh Google if you want. And then we have a guy called Ali Dashti. Ali Dashti wrote a famous book called 23 Years. It's the life of the Prophet, and it's still in print. You can still get hold of a copy of that book. He was born in a Persian family in the Bushra province. So he came from Iran before the Iranian Revolution. He was born. He in 1897 he received a traditional English religious education. He studied Islamic theology, history, Arab and Persian grammar. So he studied Arabic and Persian grammar and Islamic theology in classical literature, in madrasas in Kabbalah and Najaf, that's in Iraq. And then he returned to Iran, and he lived in Shiraz, Isfahan, and finally in Tehran, where he became involved in politics. He was going to become a cleric, but instead of becoming a cleric, he became a journalist and published a newspaper. And as I've mentioned, he also published a book. In fact, the book I don't think was published until after his death, or towards the very end of his life at least. And he got he got into trouble with the Islamic Revolution, and he actually was sent to prison. He became involved in politics, and he died in 1982. Interesting person, and you can find out more about him as well if you want to look on the internet. Now, this is what he says about the Quran. Having studied the Quran, having studied in madrasas, having learned Arabic grammar and Persian, he says the Quran contains sentences which are incomplete and not fully intelligible without the aid of commentaries. One of the things about the Quran is you will be, if you ask somebody what the meaning of a verse in the Quran is, they will consult a thing called a tafsir. They will begin to look at commentaries and to give them understanding. You will also find words within the text in brackets. These are words that are not in the original Arabic, but are put in there to try to make sense of the text, to try and make the text comprehensible. Sometimes it will be the person who's speaking, or it will be who they're speaking to. Because these things are not included in the original Arabic, and it doesn't make sense. And then he goes on to say, unfamiliar Arabic words and words used other than the normal meanings. Verbs inflected without the observance of the concords of gender and number. Grammatically applied pronouns which sometimes have no referent passages and are often remote from the subjects. These and other such aberrations in the language have given scope to critics who deny the Quran's eloquence. The problem also occupied the minds of devout Muslims. It forced the commentators to search for explanations and was probably one of the causes of disagreements over readings. So he's saying there was all kinds of problems. And when you do read the Quran, you will find this issue with the Quran. And then he goes on to say there's been much delay, however, on the question whether the Quran is miraculous in respect of its eloquence or of its subject matter or of both. And he goes on to say that scholars did, there were scholars who did say that it wasn't eloquent, but its subject matter is what made it miraculous. But that was an early view. Much later on, this whole mythology around the Quran grew, and it became this book that was, a miracle. It became this idea that it was perfect, its grammar was perfect. Although, of course, there is a verse that contained in the Quran that does talk about this test, but nobody has ever defined properly what that test is. But when you read it, the problem with it is the language and the syntax, and so Abraham on Nazam, who openly acknowledged that the arrangements and syntax of the Quran are not miraculous, and that work of equal or greater value could be produced by other God-fearing persons. So this is a Muslim scholar from the early period saying that it could be reproduced. But then he says it is miraculous because it predicted the future. Well, I don't know. I've never come across it predicting the future. But there was some concessions early on where people did admit that there was an issue. But this view, I think, swiftly got backtracked on, and people no longer held that and just claimed it to be a miracle. I'll read this a little bit as well. This is something else he says. For those who consider the Quran to be a miracle because of its contents, the difficulty is rather that it contains nothing new in the sense of ideas not already expressed by others. All the moral precepts of the Quran are self-evident and generally acknowledged. The stories in it are taken in identical or slightly modified forms from the law of the Jews and Christians whose rabbis and monks Muhammad had met and consulted on his journeys to Syria, and from memories conserved by the descendants of the people of Ad and Thamud. Well, we'll look at a bit more in detail at that area of the Quran, where the source material, in another video. The last person I want to look at for his opinion on the Quran and as a piece of literature is a guy called Thomas Carlyle. Now, Thomas Carlyle was a Scottish philosopher, a satirical writer, an essayist, a translator, historian, mathematician and teacher. He was considered one of the most important social commentators of his time, and he presented many lectures during his lifetime with certain acclaim in the Victorian era. So this is somebody from the Victorian era, and he could hold his own in, he was a great orator, and he lectured and was well known in that period. Now his view is, I'm only going to read a little bit of it, but his view is even more probably severe than the other two views I have shared. So I'll leave you to make what you will of it. I must say, the Quran is as toilsome reading as I ever undertook. A wearisome, confused jumble, crude, incondite, endless iterations, long-windedness, entanglement, most crude, incondite, and he goes on, and he says, nothing but a sense of duty could carry any European through the Quran. So that's quite a... and I'm actually not reading everything that he's written. I'm just reading part of what he's written. That's Thomas Carlyle. If you want to read the full sense of what he says, you can get that on the internet. And so that's three people's opinion on the writing, the literary merit and style of the Quran. Of course, you'll get a very different impression when you talk to Muslims. They'll talk about this being a miraculous book. They'll talk about it being a perfect book, that no other book is like it. And I must admit, when I looked at a Quran, I thought this book is so hard to read. It's so hard to. It doesn't seem to make. It seems to jump all over the place. There's lots of problems with it, and I didn't know whether there was, I didn't know any of this at that time, and it's only as I've done research I began to discover this material, and that's made sense of why it's difficult to read. And the excuse that it's because it's translated, you can translate anything from any language into another language and it'll be perfectly understandable and comprehensible if the original is well written. If the original is badly written, then the translator, however much he would like to, cannot translate it properly and still remain faithful to the original text. So thank you very much for listening to this video. This is the first of a few on this. In the next video I would like to look at what I believe is the source material that the Quran was derived from. And so that will be in my next video. I appreciate any feedback, any comments you have, anything you'd like to put. And I do thank you for watching this video, and God bless you. Bye.